What happens if Galadriel takes the One Ring? There is a moment in the Garden of LOTR where the fate of the entire world balances on a single breath. Frodo Baggins holds out the One Ring. He offers it freely. And Galadriel, the greatest of all elven women, the one being in Middle-earth who might actually have the power to wield it, stands very still and describes exactly what she would become. Not what she might become, what she would become. In place of the Dark Lord, you will set up a queen, and I shall not be dark, but beautiful and terrible as the morning and the night. All shall love me and despair. Here is what the movies want you to take from that scene. A good person passes a test. She chooses humility. She steps back from the edge, and the danger passes, and the camera moves on, and you breathe again, and feel reassured that the wise are wise, and the good are good, and the ring is still safely in the hands of the hobbit. But here is what the text is actually showing you. Galadriel is not refusing the ring because she fears she might fail. She is refusing it because she already knows exactly what she would become, down to the specific texture of the transformation, and she has spent 3,000 years quietly building the architecture of her own resistance against that version of herself. That speech is not humility. It is a diagnosis. It is the kind of precision that only comes from someone who has run this calculation to its conclusion long before the moment of temptation arrived. This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. This is what the text says, when you follow it all the way down, through the Silmarillion, through unfinished tales, through Tolkien's private letters, through everything he wrote about who Galadriel actually was before she was the serene and luminous figure standing at the edge of that reflecting pool. And the question that sits at the heart of all of it, the question this script is going to live inside for the next hour, is this. If she had taken the ring and used it and won and built something genuinely beautiful from the wreckage of Sauron's defeat, something real and lasting and full of light by her own design, would that world have been worse than the one that actually survived? Or would it have been something more terrible than anything Sauron ever dreamed of? Hold that question. We are going to earn the answer together. Because before we can understand what happens when Galadriel takes the ring, we have to understand something that the Peter Jackson films spent almost no time on at all. We have to understand why the ring was always going to offer her something real. The rings of power were not made as weapons. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the thing that changes everything else. Sauron did not forge 19 rings and one master ring because he wanted to hand out magical artifacts to his enemies. He made them because he understood, with the precision of a craftsman who had studied under the greatest smith in the history of Arda, that the deepest desire of every powerful being in Middle-earth was the same desire. The desire to preserve, to protect, to hold against the turning of time the things that would otherwise be lost. Tolkien writes this in The Shadow of the Past. He elaborates it in Letter 246, where he says something that should stop every reader cold. He says that the ring would give a well-intentioned bearer the power to do good in what appears to be a rational and justifiable way. Not a corrupt way, not a visibly evil way, a way that looks like salvation and feels like virtue and is, in the deepest possible sense, catastrophic. That is the machinery. That is what makes the ring more dangerous than a sword or an army or a plague. It does not make you evil. It perfects you. Now think about what that means when the bearer is Galadriel. Unfinished Tales, in the history of Galadriel and Celeborn, gives us something the movies never touched. It tells us that before the Oath of Feanor, before the kinslaying, before any of the catastrophes that defined the First Age, Galadriel had already made her decision to leave Valinor. Not because Feanor inflamed her with his speech, not because she was swept up in the tragedy of the moment, but because she wanted, in her own words recorded through Tolkien's notes, a realm of her own, a domain she could shape according to her will and her wisdom, a place where she could govern. That desire is older than the ring by thousands of years. It predates every dark thing that happened in the Legendarium. It is not corruption, it is ambition, the genuine, visionary, Noldoran ambition of someone who looked at the world and saw what it could be if the right mind were shaping it. And then picture this. It is the Second Age, and the figure who calls himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, is moving through the elven kingdoms with his bright eyes and his flattering tongue, and his vast, seductive knowledge of craft. He comes to Eregion. He works alongside Celebrimbor. He is patient and brilliant and generous and utterly false, and most of the elven lords cannot see through him at all. But Galadriel can. She tests his motives with her sight, as the Silmarillion tells us, and she sees what he is, and she refuses him, and she warns the others. Anatar smiles and moves on, and the warning is not heeded, and the tragedy of Eregion unfolds as it must. But here is the thing that matters. Sauron looked into Galadriel's mind, and she looked into his, and both of them came away knowing something important. Sauron learned the shape of her resistance. He learned exactly what she would not yield to. He learned that flattery would not work, that promises of craft and knowledge would not work, that the approach that worked on Celebrimbor would shatter against her like water on stone. What that means is that the One Ring's approach to Galadriel was never going to be Anatar's approach. It was going to be something else, something targeted not at her craft or her curiosity, but at the one desire that Anatar had never been able to reach, the oldest desire, the one she carried out of Valinor before the First Age began, the desire for a realm of her own. And this is where the canon layers start to stack in ways that I think most people who love these books have never fully assembled in one place. Because Galadriel is not just a powerful elf standing in a garden with a ring being offered to her. She is a woman who has carried the doom of the Noldor for 3 ages, who was denied return to Valinor and built Lothlorien instead, who has spent 3,000 years wearing Nenya, the Ring of Water, bending the borders of her realm against the turning of the world, holding back the shadow, preserving what she loves by the force of her own will, channeled through a ring of power. She already knows what it feels like to hold a ring and shape reality with it. The One Ring was not offering her something foreign. It was offering her something familiar, turned up to a volume she had never heard before. So let us build this carefully. Let us actually trace the trajectory. Because the question is not just, what would Galadriel become? The question is, what would she do first? And what would follow from that? And how long before anyone could tell the difference between her reign and salvation? Start with the moment of taking. Frodo holds out the ring. Galadriel reaches for it, and in that instant, 3 things happen simultaneously that the casual reader of Tolkien has almost certainly never connected, because they are scattered across 3 different books, and Tolkien never assembled them in one chapter. First thing, Nenya activates in a new way. Tolkien confirms in The Shadow of the Past and elsewhere that the 3 rings, Nenya, Narya, and Vilya, were kept free from Sauron's knowledge only because their bearers never touched the One Ring. The 3 were made after the One and independently of it, but the One was made to comprehend and control all the others, and the connection it establishes is not metaphorical. It is real, mechanical. The moment any bearer of a 3 touches the One, Sauron perceives them. He sees everything they have done with their ring, every working, every ward, every year of effort, laid open to him like a book. Think about what that means for Galadriel specifically. Nenya has been working in Lothlorien for over 3,000 years. The borders of the Golden Wood, the timeless quality of that realm, the way that seasons do not quite turn the same way inside it, the way that grief and age and corruption cannot quite gain purchase there, all of that is Nenya's doing. 3 millennia of continuous, careful, intricate work. And the moment Galadriel touches the One Ring, every detail of that work is visible to Sauron in Barad-dûr. But here is where it gets strange, because Galadriel has the One Ring now. which means she has something Sauron did not anticipate when he designed this vulnerability. She does not just have Nenya's power suddenly stripped bare. She has Nenya's power, amplified by the One Ring, running through her simultaneously with the One's own vast reserve of will and dominion. The exposure to Sauron is real, but the power she has in that moment is also real. And unlike Frodo, unlike Bilbo, unlike anyone else who ever touched the ring in the story, she is not a small and simple creature whose will is easily overwhelmed. She is Galadriel. And the question that follows immediately from that is one Tolkien scholars have circled without fully landing on. Does she lose control immediately, or does she, for a period of time that might be hours or days or years, actually wield it? Tolkien's cosmological rules tell us the answer. Letter 246 tells us the answer. The ring scales with the bearer's power. A great mind becomes a great tyrant, not immediately, not visibly, but by degrees, through choices that seem correct at the time, through a will that bends slowly rather than breaking all at once. For Galadriel, that process would not be a sudden fall. It would be a long, gradual, magnificent descent into something that looked, for a very long time, exactly like what she intended. Second thing that happens in that moment of taking. Elrond and Gandalf are exposed. Vilya is on Elrond's hand in Rivendell. Narya is on Gandalf's hand, somewhere in the wilderness south of Lothlorien. Both of them, in the instant Galadriel's fingers close on the One Ring, become visible to Sauron. Not just Galadriel, all three of the Great Bearers at once. Rivendell's hidden power, Gandalf's centuries of resistance work across Middle-earth. The entire invisible architecture of the Third Age's defense against Sauron. The thing that Tolkien in the appendices calls the work of the Keepers of the Three, laid bare in one moment. And now Sauron knows. Or rather, Sauron knows for a moment. For a moment before Galadriel does something about it, before the One Ring's power starts flowing through her hands and the calculation of what to do first, destroy Sauron, protect the others, seal the breach, becomes the most important decision anyone has ever made. Does she make the right call? Picture this. Lothlorien at the moment of taking. The air changes first. Not dramatically, not with lightning or earthquake, but with a quality shift. The way a room changes when someone who has been waiting very patiently finally decides to stop waiting. The Malorn trees are still gold. The grass is still silver in the starlight, but the light around Galadriel is different. It is brighter than it was. It is more organized than ordinary brightness. It moves with intention. She stands in the garden where Frodo offered her the ring, and she has it now, and the first thing she feels is not power. The first thing she feels is clarity, the peculiar crystalline clarity of someone who has spent 3,000 years seeing the world through a lens that was already remarkable and is now, for the first time, fully open. She sees Sauron in Barad-dûr. She sees him become aware of her. She sees the dark flash of recognition cross the distance between them, the terrible moment when the eye turns and focuses and understands what has happened. And then she does something Sauron did not expect. She smiles. Because she has been waiting for this too. Not consciously, not intentionally, but the part of her that left Valinor before the First Age, the part that looked at the world and saw what it could be under the right hands, that part has always known that this was the only way the story could end with her still in it. Not as a keeper of someone else's peace, as the architect of her own. She reaches through the One Ring and through Nenya simultaneously, and she begins. What she begins is not a war, not yet. What she begins is a rearrangement. The third thing that happens in that moment of taking is the one that the casual viewer never considers at all, because it requires knowing something about Galadriel's history that the movies entirely omit. She has the ring, and she has Nenya, and she has 3,000 years of practice, holding reality to a shape she prefers, and she is, by Tolkien's own comparison in Unfinished Tales, the only elf in Middle-earth who matched Feanor himself in the power of her mind. Think about what Feanor did with his mind. He made the Silmarils. He captured the light of the two trees in jewels of his own crafting, light that was otherwise lost forever. The greatest act of individual creation in the history of Arda, accomplished by will and skill, and a kind of genius that Tolkien says was unrepeatable. Galadriel's mind, according to Tolkien, ran at that level. And now it has the One Ring. What she creates would not be crude. What she creates would not be a tower, and an army and a burning eye. What she creates would be, to any outside observer, indistinguishable from paradise. Let us follow this now. Let us actually trace what a ring-bearer Galadriel does in the first years of her reign, because this is where Tolkien's rules produce implications that nobody in the lore community has fully assembled into a single picture. She defeats Sauron first. On that point, there is almost no doubt. Tolkien writes in Letter 246 that a bearer of Galadriel's stature could match and overcome Sauron's power, particularly with the One Ring in her possession. Sauron's power is not infinite. It is vast and terrible, but it is also, in the Third Age, already reduced from what it was. He lost the ring at the end of the Second Age. He lost his body in the War of the Last Alliance. He has spent centuries rebuilding what he was. And Galadriel, in her original form, without the ring, was already an adversary he treated with enormous respect, as his decision to personally avoid confronting her during the War of the Ring implies. With the ring, she takes him apart. The question is not whether she defeats him, the question is what the method of his defeat costs her. And here Tolkien's rules about the nature of evil become crucial, because evil in Arda is always parasitic. It always requires something to feed on, and the act of destroying Sauron with the One Ring is not like cutting off a head, it is more like absorbing a fire. The ring was made with Sauron's will poured into it. Destroying its maker through it is not a clean act. It is the kind of act that leaves a mark. How much of Sauron's purpose flows backward through the ring into Galadriel in the moment of his defeat? Tolkien does not tell us, but the mechanics he establishes suggest the answer is enough. Enough that the thing she destroys is Sauron the Warlord, Sauron the Deceiver, Sauron the Lieutenant of Morgoth, but the thing that survives the destruction, that pours back into the world through the only available vessel, which is her, is the deepest drive behind all of it, the desire to order, to govern, to make everything conform to a single will's idea of how it should be, which was already her desire, which has been her desire since before the First Age. Now the ring is not amplifying something foreign. It is amplifying something she already carries. And the difference between Galadriel's version of that desire and Sauron's is real. It is genuine. She means it as love, and he meant it as domination. But the ring does not care about that distinction. The ring only knows that the desire to govern is there, and that it can work with that. And here is what nobody asks. How long before her subjects notice the difference? Tolkien gives us a picture in the appendices and in The Rings of Power and the Third Age of what Lothlorien looks like under Nenya's influence. It is a preserved place. Time moves differently there. Things that would decay elsewhere hold their form. The grief of ages does not accumulate the way it does outside the borders. It is beautiful. It is also, in a very quiet way, static, held, arrested. Now imagine that quality, that preservation, that holding against the natural turn of the world, extended across all of Middle-earth by a will of incomparably greater power than Nenya alone. The crops do not fail, the rivers run clean, the forests do not recede. The seasons turn, but gently, and the harshness goes out of them. People live longer than they should. They are healthier than they have any natural right to be. They look around at the world Galadriel has made and they think, this is what peace looks like. This is what we were fighting for. And they are not wrong. That is what makes this so devastating. Because now return to Tolkien's statement in Letter 246. The ring gives a well-intentioned bearer the power to do good in a way that is seemingly rational and justifiable. He is describing exactly this, a world that looks saved, a world that feels like victory, a world where the people living in it have no framework for understanding what they have lost, because what they have lost is invisible, internal, abstract. What they have lost is the freedom to choose their own shape. Not in a visible way. Galadriel is not putting them in chains. She is not burning their cities or enslaving their children. She is doing something infinitely more subtle and infinitely more total. She is arranging the world so that the right choices are easy and the wrong choices are difficult, so that the grain of life runs in directions she has considered and approved, so that over generations, the people of Middle-earth gradually lose the capacity to imagine anything other than what she has built, because nothing in their experience has ever suggested that the world could be otherwise. Tolkien has a word for this in his essays and letters. He calls it the machine, not a mechanical device, but a mode of operating on the world, a philosophy that says the goal justifies the means, that efficiency of outcome is more important than the process by which the outcome is reached, that the world can be made good by the imposition of a sufficiently good will from outside. Galadriel with the One Ring becomes the machine, the most beautiful, most genuine, most well-intended machine that Middle-earth has ever seen, and it would still be the end of everything Tolkien believed mattered. Now hold that picture. Because before we go further into what the reign of Queen Galadriel actually produces, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand something about who she was before any of this, before Lothlorien, before Nenya, before the Second Age and the Third. Because the ring is not creating a desire in her. It is completing one that has been there from the very first pages of the Legendarium. The Silmarillion's chapter of the Flight of the Noldor is one of the most important chapters in all of Tolkien's writing, and it is one of the most often read quickly and moved past. Everyone knows the broad shape of it. Feanor makes his oath. The Noldor leave Valinor. Tragedy follows. But buried in that chapter, and elaborated in the notes collected in Unfinished Tales, is a piece of Galadriel's story that almost never gets the attention it deserves. She left before Feanor's speech. Or at the very least, she had already decided to leave before the speech inflamed anyone into action. Tolkien is not entirely consistent on the specific timing across his various drafts, as Christopher Tolkien makes clear in the editorial notes to Unfinished Tales. But what is consistent across all versions is the motive. She wanted, as Tolkien writes in one set of notes, a realm of her own, and Valinor could not give her that, because Valinor already had its order, already had its governors, already had its Valar shaping it according to their own wisdom. She wanted to govern something herself, not because she was corrupt, not because she was rebellious in the petty sense, but because she had the kind of mind that looks at the world and sees it as something that can be improved, shaped, ordered into something better than it is. And that kind of mind cannot flourish in a place where all the shaping has already been done. This is a profound character detail, and I want to sit in it for a moment, because it is the key to understanding everything else. The desire that the One Ring would exploit in Galadriel is not a weakness, it is a strength. It is the thing that made her great. It is the same impulse that made Feanor great, that made Celebrimbor great, that made every genuinely powerful mind in the Legendarium both magnificent and dangerous. The capacity to look at what is and imagine what could be, and to have the will and skill to build the bridge between them. Tolkien is not writing a story about corruption as a moral failure. He is writing a story about corruption as a tragic transformation of what is best in a person into what is worst, not by replacing their virtues with vices, but by taking their virtues and pushing them one degree past the point where they serve others and into the territory where they serve themselves alone. Galadriel's desire for a realm of her own is a virtue. It produced Lothlorien. It kept the Golden Wood alive for 3,000 years as a refuge and a source of beauty and strength in a darkening world. That desire, expressed through Nenya and discipline, and the wisdom she accumulated across 3 ages of patient work, built something genuinely good. The same desire, expressed through the one ring with no check on it, no counsel to balance it, no Celeborn to stand beside her, and no Frodo to hold the other scale, becomes the thing she described in the garden: beautiful, terrible, absolute. Because here is what that actually means. The doom of the Noldor, which Tolkien describes in Unfinished Tales as a wound Galadriel carried for the entirety of the Third Age, is not just a curse. It is a history. It is the weight of everything she chose, and everything she lost, and everything she built in exile from the world she came from. The doom says, "You left, and you cannot return. Not yet, not until you have earned it, not until the work of the exile is complete." For 3 ages she carried that. She watched everyone around her diminish, or sail west, or die. She watched Celebrimbor, who was perhaps the greatest craftsman of the Second Age, destroyed by Sauron in agony. She watched Eregion fall. She watched the wars that remade the shape of the world, literally reshaped the geography of Arda, and she was still standing at the end of all of it, still here, still holding. That is not weakness. That is something almost inhuman in its endurance. But now ask yourself, what 3 ages of exile and grief and endurance do to even the greatest mind? Not corrupting it, not breaking it, but shaping it, the way water shapes stone, slowly and inevitably and without malice. 3 ages of watching the world fail to be what it should be. 3 ages of holding something beautiful against the tide of something dark. 3 ages of discipline and patience and restraint. And the ring arrives and it says, "You do not have to restrain yourself anymore." Not, "You can be cruel," not, "You can destroy." It says, "You can finally build, the way you always knew you could." Without limit, without the need to be careful, to be measured, to hold back because the people around you are smaller than you are, and the wrong move might break them, without the exhausting, endless work of governance by consent from a people who cannot fully understand what you see. You can just build it. Picture this. The first year after Sauron's fall. The world does not look like it has been conquered. It looks like it has been healed. Galadriel moves through it with a quality of attention that no one who is not watching very carefully would recognize as anything other than compassion. She speaks with the men of Gondor, and she listens to them, genuinely listens, the way she has always listened, with the full depth of her sight reading beneath the words to the needs underneath. She understands what they want before they have finished asking for it. She makes decisions about their lives that are consistently, demonstrably correct. The harvests are better than they have been in living memory. The borders hold. The creatures that used to come out of Mirkwood, now being called something softer because the darkness has lifted, do not come anymore. The plague that used to move through the river towns every generation does not come either. No one remembers, because no one is old enough to remember, what Middle-earth was like when it shaped itself. Aragorn is still alive in this version of events, assuming he survived whatever battle ended Sauron, and he watches this with eyes that understand more than most men would. He was raised in Rivendell. He knows Galadriel. He knows what she was before, and he looks at what she is becoming. This gradual brightening that is also a gradual hardening, this growing light that casts increasingly certain shadows, and he knows what he is seeing. But what does he do about it? This is the question that Tolkien's world is built to make unanswerable in the most uncomfortable way. Because Galadriel is not doing anything wrong. By every visible measure she is doing everything right. The evidence of harm is invisible. It is in the future. It is in the generations not yet born who will never know they are choosing from a menu, she wrote. It is in the slow erosion of the capacity for self-determination, in a world where the right choices are always already arranged, and the wrong choices are always already made difficult or impossible. How do you argue against a queen whose reign is genuinely good? How do you fight someone whose victory over your darkness is also her victory over your freedom? and neither of you can see the dividing line. Tolkien answers this question obliquely in his essays and letters, particularly in On Fairy Stories, and in the letter where he discusses the mechanics of the ring in relation to good intentions. He answers it by saying that it is not about the outcome, it is about the process. A world saved by the imposition of one will, no matter how good that will is not a saved world. It is a world that has traded one form of captivity for another, more beautiful one. And here is where the lore layers start to interact in ways that should make your blood run cold. Because if Galadriel has the One Ring and has defeated Sauron, what happens to the other rings of power? Tolkien confirms in the appendices that the fate of the three was tied to the One. When the One was destroyed, the three lost their power and faded. This is what happens at the end of the actual story. Galadriel sails west because Nenya has lost its virtue, and the work it was doing, the preservation of Lothlorien, can no longer be maintained. But the One was not destroyed in this version. The One was taken. Which means the three are still active. Which means Nenya, Narya, and Vilya are all still running, and they are all running in the shadow of the One, which is now in the hands of one of the three's keepers. Now think about what that means for Elrond and Gandalf. Vilya on Elrond's hand is not destroyed. It is changed. The moment Galadriel took the One, Sauron perceived Vilya, and then Sauron was destroyed. And now the One Ring is in the hands of someone who is, by any measure, a greater and more benevolent master than Sauron. But Tolkien's rules do not care about benevolence. The One Ring controls the others. The bearer of the One commands the bearers of the others, whether she intends to or not, whether she is aware of it or not. Elrond in Rivendell feels something change in Vilya that he cannot fully name. The ring is still working. Its power is still there. But there is a quality to it now, a kind of orientation it did not have before, a sense that its virtue is flowing in a direction he did not choose. And he is, by every account in the Legendarium, one of the wisest beings left in Middle-earth. He would recognize what this means almost immediately. What does he do? He does not have good options. Sailing west is still available to him. The Grey Havens still exist. But sailing west means abandoning his people in the moment of the world's reshaping, leaving them without whatever counsel and protection he might still offer. And Elrond Half-Elven, who chose the half of men in order to remain in the world with those he loved, who founded Rivendell precisely as a refuge and a place of counsel, would not easily make that choice. So he stays. And Vilya serves a master he did not choose. And Rivendell, which was always a place of free counsel and open lore, begins very gradually and entirely without violence to bend in the direction of the golden current running from Lothlorien. Not by command, not by force, but the way water flows downhill, the way iron orients to a magnet. And Gandalf. Pay attention to this next part, because this is the thread that nobody pulls. Narya, the Ring of Fire, was given to Gandalf by Círdan at the Grey Havens when Gandalf first arrived in Middle-earth in the Third Age. Círdan's reason, as the text records, was that he perceived in Gandalf a spirit capable of bearing its burden, a spirit that would be tested and would need the fire that Narya offered. The Ring of Fire does not warm rooms and light candles. Its power, as Tolkien describes it in the Rings of Power and the Third Age, is the kindling of courage and hope in others. Its virtue is specifically about inspiring resistance, sustaining hearts that are failing, keeping the light alive in dark places. Narya, if the One Ring has taken it into the golden orbit of Galadriel's will, would not immediately lose that function. But its function would change in direction. The courage it kindles and the hope it inspires would flow toward Galadriel's order rather than away from it. The fires it lights would warm the rooms of her queendom. The resistance it once helped sustain would be redirected, subtly and without violence, into support. And Gandalf, who was sent to Middle-earth specifically to stir men and elves to resistance against Sauron, who walked the roads of Middle-earth for 2,000 years without revealing his power, who understood better than almost anyone the importance of letting others choose their own path, rather than walking it for them, would feel this in Narya like a corruption of his own purpose. He would know what was happening. And here is the terrible truth of his position. He cannot fight her. Not because she would destroy him, though she probably could at this point, but because fighting her would require him to become something he is also forbidden to be. The Astari were sent to Middle-earth with specific instructions from Manwë, documented in unfinished tales in the Astari, instructions that prohibited them from matching power with power, from dominating other wills, from seizing the tools of the enemy to fight the enemy. That prohibition was put in place specifically because Tolkien understood that the method of resistance matters as much as the goal. An Istari who fought a ring-bearer with the full force of a Maya's power would be violating the same principle that makes Galadriel's queendom problematic, just in a different direction. So Gandalf watches and counsels where he can, and walks roads that are increasingly well-maintained, and increasingly safe, and increasingly pointed in one direction. And he carries Narya, whose fire is still real but whose aim has changed. And eventually perhaps he sails west, not in triumph, not in the peace that the end of the actual story gives him, but in the quiet, unwitnessed defeat of someone who did everything right and still could not prevent what came. Now we are deep in the speculation. Now we are far past the point where Tolkien's text gives us direct answers, and into the territory where his cosmological rules are producing implications he drew separately and never assembled. So let me be clear about what is confirmed and what is extrapolated, because the distinction matters and the viewer deserves to know where the line is. Confirmed. The one ring controls the others. The three's power is visible to Sauron when any three-bearer touches the one. The ring scales with the bearer's existing power. The ring amplifies and weaponizes existing desire. Galadriel's specific desire for a realm of her own predates the First Age. Her power of mind equals Feanor's by Tolkien's own comparison. Extrapolated. The specific political and spiritual shape of her queendom. The specific fate of Elrond and Gandalf under her inadvertent command. The timeline of the world's gradual loss of self-determination. All of this follows logically from the confirmed rules, but Tolkien never assembled it this way. I want to be clear about that because I think the distinction is actually part of the point. Tolkien built a cosmological system so internally consistent that it produces these implications on its own. You do not have to invent anything to follow this thread. You just have to follow it. Now let us follow it further. Because we have only been talking about elves and Maiar and the upper echelons of power. We have not talked about men. And men are the reason this gets complicated in a way that goes beyond politics. Tolkien writes in The Rings of Power and the Third Age, and elaborates in his letters that men are the most vulnerable to the ring's influence, precisely because of their mortality. The ring promises them what they most desire, and what they most desire is more time. The Nine, the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths are the illustration of what happens when men take rings of power. They got their immortality, they kept their rings, and they became shadows, eventually, prolonged beyond their natural span by a will that was not their own, serving the very power that enslaved them, while being unable to die. The 9 rings are destroyed with Sauron. So in Galadriel's world, the Nazgul are gone. There are no Ringwraiths. There are no undead servants of the Dark Lord haunting the roads. But there is something else. The men of Middle-earth in the Third Age, particularly the men of Gondor and of Rohan and of the smaller kingdoms, have a complicated relationship with their own mortality. Tolkien spends a great deal of the appendices and much of the structure of the Aragorn storyline exploring what it means to be Númenórean, to carry the memory of a longer lifespan in your blood, to know that your ancestors lived 3 or 4 centuries and your own span is half that or less. The Númenóreans fell precisely because they could not accept the gift of men, which Tolkien elsewhere calls Ilúvatar's gift, and Morgoth characterized as the curse of men, the acceptance of mortality, the willingness to let go. Now Galadriel, with the One Ring, offers them the next best thing. not immortality. She is not making Nazgul. But she is building a world where the conditions of life are so controlled and so optimized that people live longer than they should, that children do not die of the diseases that used to take half of them before their 3rd year, that the accidents and violence and hard winters and bad harvests that culled previous generations simply do not occur anymore. She is extending life not by magic, but by the application of an essentially perfect governing intelligence to every variable that shortens it. And the people love her for it. Of course they do. How could they not? She is not asking them to worship her. She is not building temples to herself. She is just solving every problem that presents itself with the kind of elegant precision that makes the solution look inevitable. And the world gets better and better by every measurable standard. And no one who benefits from this improvement has any reason to question it. Here is the thing nobody talks about when they discuss this scenario. The elves are supposed to leave. That is the plan. That is what the Third Age was always building toward. The dominion of men, as Tolkien calls it, the age where the elves sail west and men come into their own inheritance and shape the world according to their own will, without the immortal, wiser, older powers standing over them. The entire emotional architecture of the Lord of the Rings is built toward this. The elves depart. The ring is destroyed. The age of men begins. And men must now be responsible for themselves in a world without the crutch of elven wisdom and the ring's terrible ordering force. The tragedy is real. Arwen stays. Lothlorien fades. Rivendell empties. The world gets lonelier and smaller and more human, and it is simultaneously sad and right, because it is theirs now. In Galadriel's world, this never happens. She does not sail west. Why would she? She has what she always wanted. She has the realm she left Valinor to build. She has the power to maintain it indefinitely. And the elves who might otherwise have faded and departed find that the world is still worth staying in, because the One Ring is keeping the quality of things at a level that makes departure feel unnecessary. So the elves stay, and men never grow up. Tolkien believed that the capacity for self-determination was not merely a political value. It was a spiritual one. It was the thing that distinguished free peoples from enslaved ones, not in the legal sense, but in the deepest sense of what it means to be an independently existing will in a universe that respects independent wills. The theology of Tolkien's Legendarium is built on this. Ilúvatar gives the Ainur free will, and they exercise it, and Morgoth's discord enters the music, and the tragedy of the world follows. But that tragedy is also the possibility of the world's story. Without free will, without the capacity to choose wrongly, there is no story. There is only Galadriel's arrangement. And now ask yourself the question at the heart of all of this. Not the question of whether her world is beautiful. It is. Not the question of whether her intentions are good. They are. But the question of what a world looks like when every meaningful choice has already been made by someone wiser than you before you were born. And the evidence of that choice is so overwhelming and the alternatives are so invisible that the concept of choosing differently never arises. That is not peace. That is something else. Let us call it by the name Tolkien would use. It is enchantment, the elven enchantment that the Lord of the Rings is very careful to distinguish from darker kinds of magic, not because it is harmless, but because the distinction is more subtle. In On Fairy Stories, and in various letters, Tolkien distinguishes between the enchantment that invites participation and wonder, and the enchantment that absorbs and subsumes, that takes the enchanted person and makes them part of the enchanter's vision rather than their own. Lothlorien under Nenya is always right at the edge of this distinction. The Fellowship enters it and feels the pull of it. Sam Gamgee says, in one of the most perceptive lines any hobbit ever speaks, that it feels like being inside a song, which is beautiful, but a song you are inside cannot be argued with. Galadriel with the One Ring does not move right. She moves into the song, and eventually so does everything else. Now here is the moment in the lore where the speculation starts to arrive at its most devastating implication. And this is the place I want to sit in for a while, because it is the place where Tolkien's world stops being about elves and rings and starts being about something that is true outside his fiction. Sauron's great lie was not that he was evil. His great lie was that he wanted order, that he wanted a world without waste, and without the suffering that comes from disorder and conflict, and the 1,000 ways that free peoples fail each other. That is what Tolkien establishes in the Istari, and in the Silmarillion's closing chapters. Sauron, in the Second Age, genuinely believed, or came close enough to believing, to be functionally identical, that the world would be better under a single intelligent governing will. He was wrong. But he was wrong in a way that is surprisingly hard to articulate from inside the world he would have built, because the articulation requires appealing to values that only have meaning when you are free enough to hold them. Galadriel's world makes the same mistake by different means. And here is the thing that makes this unbearable. She knows it. She knows it at the moment she describes what she would become in the garden. She knows it because she has been looking at this truth for 3 ages. The vision she describes, beautiful and terrible, all shall love me and despair, is not just a warning about corruption, it is a recognition. She has already seen, with the same clarity that lets her see into the hearts of the fellowship one by one, that the thing she would become is not a monster by any visible measure. It is something that the world would accept gladly, and celebrate with genuine gratitude, and be imprisoned by, without ever knowing it. She knows the word for this. The word is despair, not the despair of grief or pain or loss. The despair that comes from a world where the highest good is already present and permanent, and yours for the accepting, and there is nothing left to strive toward, because the striving has already been done for you. All shall love me, and despair. That is not a warning about what she would do to her enemies. It is a warning about what she would do to the people who loved her best. Picture this, generations later, not years, not decades, centuries. A young man in what used to be called Gondor, which now has a different name, or perhaps the same name spoken with different feelings, stands at the window of a house that has never known hunger, or cold, or the shadow of war. He is healthy. His children are healthy. His wife will outlive her grandparents' grandparents by decades because the conditions of life have been so perfected that the old spans simply do not apply anymore. He is standing at the window and looking at the stars. He does not know why he is doing it. There is nothing out there that he needs. There is nothing the night can offer him that the day has not already provided. The stars are beautiful, he supposes. He was told they are beautiful. Everyone agrees they are beautiful. He stands at the window for a while, and then he goes to bed. He does not know that the particular quality of his standing there, that reaching toward something unnamed and undirected and not yet known, is the thing Tolkien called the desire for the perilous realm, the desire for something beyond the edge of the world. The desire that stories are made of and quests begin from, and the greatest human achievements arise out of. He does not know that this desire is what makes men the race that Ilúvatar loved, with a love that puzzled the other Ainur, because it is a desire that has no settled object, and can therefore point anywhere, toward good or evil, toward creation or destruction, toward love or conquest, toward the open sea or the closed city. He does not know any of this because no one has ever named it for him. No one needed to. By the time he was born, all the quests were over. The perilous realm was administered. He goes to bed. And somewhere in the west, in a tower built of light and filled with a music so beautiful it is physically difficult to be unhappy in its presence, Galadriel sits with Nenya still on her hand, and the One Ring, and a weight that has been growing in her since the first year, and that she has not allowed herself to name. Because naming it would mean understanding it, and understanding it would mean something she cannot afford to understand yet, because the alternative is unthinkable now. The world she has built is too beautiful to unmake, and the people who live in it would suffer enormously if she released them suddenly into an unmanaged world they have forgotten how to navigate. So she holds it together one more generation, and then another, and the weight grows. And it is the weight of knowing. She has read the hearts of more people than she can count, across 3,000 years of Nenya's use. She knows the shape of human longing better than most humans do, and she has watched it change, decade by decade, in the world she manages. She has watched the perilous realms slowly close, not violently, not catastrophically, just quietly, the way a fire dims when there is nothing left to burn. She has watched the stories get shorter and smaller and more certain of their endings. She has watched men stop standing at the edges of things and looking out. She knows what she has done. She will not stop, because she cannot. Not anymore. The One Ring does not make her cruel. It makes her unable to choose the alternative, because the alternative, releasing control, accepting the cost of freedom, allowing the world to fail sometimes so that it can choose sometimes, requires the capacity to value something other than the world's improvement. And that capacity was the first thing the ring took, gently and without her noticing, somewhere in the early years before the campaign against Sauron was finished. She thought she was using the ring. The ring was always using her. Tolkien knows this truth better than almost any author who has ever written about power, and he knows it because it is a truth that does not require magic to be real. The person who believes they are the right one to hold power is almost always wrong, not because they are evil, but because the belief itself is the corruption. The willingness to say, someone must be in charge, and it might as well be someone good, is the first step in a journey that ends at the window of a house, where a young man stares at stars he no longer has a word for. And now return to the question. Not the same question as the cold open. That question was simple, almost innocent. If she took it and won, and built something beautiful, was it better or worse than what actually happened? But now you know more than you did then. Now the question has weight behind it. The world Galadriel builds is not worse than Sauron's world by any metric you can count. There is no death tally, no enslaved population in the obvious sense, no burning eye, no towers of iron. By every visible standard, it is immeasurably better. The harvests are good, the children survive, the stars are still beautiful. But here is the question as it stands now, with everything we have built behind it. Is a world that is genuinely good, genuinely peaceful, genuinely beautiful, but in which no one has the freedom to choose differently, even the freedom to choose wrongly, even the freedom to fail, even the freedom to stand at a window at night and feel a desire they cannot name and go looking for it without knowing what they will find? Is that world saved? Or is it something else entirely? And who, in that world, even has the language left to ask that question? This is the thing that Tolkien's refusal scene is actually about. Not the drama of the temptation. Not the virtue signaling of the refusal. Not even the character study of a great person declining power. It is about the fact that Galadriel already knows the answer to this question. She has known it for 3 ages. She has sat with the knowledge of it, carried the weight of her exile and her patience and her doom, and she has kept the answer alive in herself against every year that tried to erode it. The answer is, freedom matters more than goodness. Not because goodness does not matter, but because goodness imposed from outside is not goodness at all. It is a different thing wearing goodness's face. Tolkien writes this in Letter 96, where he describes the essential distinction between the way Ilúvatar operates in the world, which is through the free choices of free beings, even when those choices produce tragedy, and the way Morgoth and Sauron operate, which is through the subordination of all other wills to their own. He says that the characteristic of good, as he understands it theologically, is that it works with the grain of free will. It persuades, it shows, it offers. But it does not compel, even when compelling would produce better visible outcomes, because the moment it compels, it has become something other than good. Galadriel understands this. It is why she spent 3,000 years building a realm that was beautiful and could be left, that was preserved, not permanent, that was offered, not imposed. Lothlorien under Nenya is not a perfect world. It has edges. You can leave it. The world is still outside it, and the world is still difficult, and the Fellowship goes back into it after a time of rest, and it is still dangerous, and they are still mortal, and the quest is still hard. That is the difference. Not the quality of the light inside, but the existence of a door. The One Ring would seal the door, not maliciously, not intentionally, but thoroughly, and eventually, and permanently. And this is the full shape of what Galadriel was refusing in that garden. Not power, not beauty, not even a just cause. She was refusing the sealing of the door. She was refusing the world that has no outside to return to. She was refusing the version of herself that would, with the best intentions in the history of Middle-earth, turn the whole world into Lothlorien, and in doing so, destroy the very thing that made Lothlorien beautiful, which was the knowledge that it was not the whole world, that something else existed, that the song could be left. Picture this: Galadriel in the garden, in the actual scene, in the canonical scene as Tolkien wrote it. Frodo holds out the ring, and it is real. The offer is real. The power is real. The desire is real, the ancient Noldorin desire that is 3 ages old, that has been patient longer than most civilizations have existed. It is all right there in her hand if she reaches for it. She looks at it. She does not see a ring of gold. She sees the world she would build, all of it, the good harvests and the clean rivers, and the long lives, and the dying stars of human longing, and the sealed door. She sees it the way she saw the hearts of the Fellowship, clearly and completely, and without flinching. And she steps back. Not in weakness. The text is very clear that she is not stepping back in weakness. She steps back in full knowledge of what she is choosing not to take. She steps back into the smaller self, the diminished self, the self that sails west eventually, and lets the age of men begin, and accepts the cost of that, which is that the world will fail sometimes, will be dark sometimes, will be hard, and incomplete, and imperfect, in ways she could have fixed. She steps back. And it is the most powerful act in the entire Lord of the Rings. Because it is an act of love, not for her own conscience, or her own virtue, or her own comfort, but for the young man who will stand at a window generations from now and feel the desire he cannot name, and who will, in her absence, be free to go looking for it. She sails west, and she leaves the world to the one who will stand at the window and go looking. That is what the refusal is. That is what Tolkien built across 3 ages of this woman's history to arrive at. Not a test passed, not a virtue demonstrated, a gift given, at enormous personal cost, to people who will never know it was a gift. Now here is where I want to make the connection that almost never gets made in lore discussions about this scene, because it requires drawing a line between the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings, and a set of Tolkien's letters that most readers encounter separately and never triangulate. Tolkien writes in Letter 153 about the nature of the eucatastrophe, his term for the sudden turn of story toward unexpected grace, and he says that it always requires sacrifice, not suffering, necessarily, though suffering often accompanies it, but the willingness of a person or a moment to cost something, to give up something real, so that the story can turn. The eucatastrophe is not the hero winning. It is the hero paying something that makes the winning possible for someone else. Frodo at the crack of doom is the obvious eucatastrophe. He fails, in fact, technically fails, at the last moment, and Gollum takes the ring and falls, and the world is saved by accident and mercy and the long chain of choices that began with Bilbo sparing Gollum in the darkness under the misty mountains. Everyone talks about that eucatastrophe, but Galadriel's refusal in the garden is also a eucatastrophe, a quieter one, a private one. She pays something real in that moment, the oldest desire she carries, the realm she could finally truly have. And she pays it so that the larger story can continue to have the possibility of resolution. She pays it so that Frodo gets to carry the ring to Mount Doom. She pays it so that the Age of Men begins on its own terms. And she pays it alone, in a garden, with no one who fully understands the cost, standing close enough to witness it. I think about this in the context of everything Tolkien writes about the elves and their relationship to the world. The elves are bound to Arda. They love it, with a love that men, who are designed to depart, cannot fully share. The elves are the immortal keepers of the world's memory and beauty, and their tragedy is that the world changes around them, and they cannot, quite, let go of what it was. The Noldor, in particular, carry the deep wound of having loved something in Valinor, the light of the trees, the perfection of that world, so much that when it was taken from them, they followed the one who had taken it halfway across creation. Galadriel left that world voluntarily. She was the only major Noldorin figure who left without swearing the oath. She went into exile clear-eyed, knowing the cost, because the desire for a realm of her own was strong enough to outweigh even the loss of Valinor. And then she spent 3 ages being told by that desire, by the ache of it, that she could finally satisfy it if she just reached out a little further. Not with Anatar, not with Sauron's gifts, but with this, with the one ring offered by a hobbit who trusts her. She refuses. What does she get in return? She gets to go home. Eventually. The ban on her return to Valinor is lifted in the end. Because of this moment, among others. Because she has spent the Third Age earning the reversal of the doom of the Noldor with every choice she has made. She gets to sail west, and she gets to see what she left behind. But she goes to a world she left 3 ages ago. A world where Celebrimbor is dead, and Eregion is ash, and everyone she knew in Valinor before the exile is 3 ages removed from the woman she has become. She goes home to a place that is not quite the home she left, because she is not quite the person who left it. And the realm she spent 3 ages refusing to seize by force, she never gets to have at all. That is the cost. And it is enormous. The movies do not show you this. The movies show you a triumphant Galadriel stepping back from temptation, and then a glowing send-off at the Grey Havens, and then credits. The movies do not sit in the cost. They do not ask you to feel the full weight of what was given up. But the lore does. The lore, if you read it all the way through, from the early passages about her decision to leave Valinor, to the notes in Unfinished Tales, about the lifting of her ban to the canonical moment in the garden, gives you a picture of someone who spent tens of thousands of years in a continuous act of loving discipline, refusing not because she could not take, but because she understood better than anyone what taking would mean. Now here is the final thread, the one that the whole structure of this script has been building toward. We have talked about what Galadriel becomes if she takes the ring. We have talked about what the world becomes under her governance. We have talked about what she sacrifices by refusing. But there is one more question, the one that I think is the actual heart of everything Tolkien built into this scenario. Was Galadriel's refusal an act of wisdom or an act of despair? Stay with me, because this is a distinction that matters enormously, and Tolkien almost never makes it explicitly. She describes the 2 possibilities in the same speech. If she takes it, all shall love her and despair. If she refuses it, she passes the test, she remains herself, and she goes into the West diminished. She says this herself. I pass the test, I will diminish, and go into the West, and remain Galadriel. Remain Galadriel, not the terrible and beautiful queen. Remain the woman she already is. Diminished. That word, diminished, is doing enormous work in that sentence. She is not saying she will be destroyed. She is not saying she will fail. She is saying she will be smaller than she could have been. She is choosing smallness, deliberately, with full knowledge of the alternative. Is that wisdom? Yes, of course it is. We have spent this entire script establishing why it is wisdom. It is the deepest, most considered, most costly wisdom in the Lord of the Rings. But is it also, in some way, despair? Because look at the full picture of what she is choosing. She is choosing to go into the West. She is choosing to give up the world she has spent 3 ages in. She is choosing, in effect, to stop fighting. The work of the Third Age, the long patient resistance against Sauron, the maintenance of Lothlorien, the counseling of the free peoples, will be over. The elves will leave, and men will have the world, and the world will be imperfect, and people will suffer in ways that she could have prevented. She knows this. She chooses it anyway. Is there despair in that choice? A particular kind of despair, not hopelessness, not the despair of someone who has given up on the good, but the despair of someone who has understood with perfect clarity that some things cannot be fixed, that some costs cannot be avoided, that the world's freedom requires accepting the world's failures. I think there is. I think Tolkien built both things into that moment. The wisdom and the despair are not opposites in his legendarium. They are the same event seen from different angles. The wisdom of letting go and the grief of what is lost in the letting go exist simultaneously in that garden, in that moment, in that woman's face as she steps back. And the ring knows this. The ring felt it too. The ring felt the despair in her and reached for it. Because despair is what Sauron always fed on, in men with the Nazgul rings, in Denethor at Minas Tirith with the Palantir, in Frodo in the moments when the burden became too much. The ring offers relief from the despair. The ring offers the realm that will fix the things that grieve you. The ring says, you do not have to watch the world fail anymore. You can make it not fail. She says no. She says no to relief. She says no to the fixing. She accepts the grief and the diminishment and the long westward sailing away from everything she spent 3 ages tending. She accepts it because the alternative is not actually relief. The alternative is a different kind of despair. The despair of a world sealed against its own freedom. The despair of a civilization that does not know. It is despairing because the word has gone out of them. And she knows which kind of despair is survivable. The grief of the wise is survivable. It is painful and real and permanent, but it coexists with joy, with love, with the capacity for more story. The people who grieve can still stand at windows and go looking for what they feel. The world that knows loss can still know hope, because hope requires the possibility of something not yet achieved. The despair of the perfectly governed world is not survivable in the same way. It does not feel like despair from inside. It feels like contentment. But it is the contentment of a fire that has gone out, and no one in the house notices the cold because the temperature dropped so gradually, and the insulation was so perfect, and the queen is so beautiful, and the grain is so good. Galadriel chose the world that can grieve. And this is what Tolkien believed, with everything he was, about the nature of a life worth living. Not that suffering is good, not that happiness is bad, but that the capacity for genuine experience, the full range of it, the grief and the joy and the longing and the achievement and the loss and the love, requires the freedom to be unmanaged, requires the possibility of failure, requires the unsealed door. He wrote this across the entire legendarium. He wrote it in the Ainulindalë, where Ilúvatar allows Morgoth's discord into the music, because the music is truer for containing it. He wrote it in the story of Beren and Luthien, where the grief of Mandos is moved by something it has never felt before, and grants a gift that breaks the rules of the world. He wrote it in the story of Turin Turambar, where the tragedy is total and the freedom to choose wrongly is absolute, and the world is worse for everything Turin did, and yet the story is glorious, because it was real. He wrote it in the Scouring of the Shire, which the movies cut entirely, and which is perhaps the most important chapter in The Lord of the Rings, where the hobbits return home to find their home managed and improved by someone with good intentions, and destroyed in every way that matters. He wrote it in a garden in Lothlorien, in a woman with ancient eyes and a ring on her finger, who looked at the one ring, and saw the world it would make, and said, no. Not because the world was bad, because it was the wrong kind of good. Now, here is the question, as it stands at the end of everything we have built together. If Galadriel had taken the ring, and the world she made was genuinely peaceful, genuinely beautiful, genuinely without the worst of the suffering that the free age of men produced, and in that world a child was born who would never know hunger, and would never know war, and would never know what it felt like to stand at the edge of something dangerous and choose to go forward anyway, and would live and be content and die surrounded by the beauty that Galadriel made, was that child's life worse than the life of a child born in the Fourth Age, in the imperfect world that Aragorn and Arwen and Sam Gamgee and all the survivors of the War of the Ring built together, by choice and argument and failure and love? And is that question even answerable by someone who has lived in only one of those worlds? Is it answerable at all? I do not think it is. And I think Tolkien knew it was not. And I think he built the unanswerable quality of it into the scene deliberately. Because the most honest thing his legendarium ever does is resist the urge to make the right answer easy. The right answer in his world is always costly. It is always a diminishment of something. It is always a giving up of something real in exchange for something that cannot be held in the hands. Galadriel goes into the West, and the world is imperfect, and people suffer who need not have suffered, and the Shire gets temporarily destroyed by someone with good intentions, and Frodo cannot live in the world he saved. The right answer produces all of this. And it is still the right answer, because the children who grow up in that imperfect world stand at windows at night and feel the desire they cannot name, and some of them go looking for it, and what they find is a story that is their own. That is what she bought, with the oldest desire she carried, with the realm she never got to build, with 3 ages of patient exile, and Nenya's quiet work, and the terrible clarity of a mind that could see exactly what it was choosing not to take. She bought the open door. She bought the stars that still mean something. She bought the freedom of people she would never meet, to fail at things that mattered. It is the most expensive thing anyone buys in The Lord of the Rings. More expensive than Frodo's wounded hand, more expensive than Gandalf's fall in Moria, more expensive than Boromir's last stand. Because those costs were paid in moments of extremity, in crisis, in the adrenaline of impossible choices made when there was no time to think. Galadriel's cost was paid in full knowledge, with time to think, in a garden, looking at a ring of gold held by a hobbit who trusted her completely. That is the shape of the refusal. That is who she was. And that is why the scene in the garden, in the actual book, in Tolkien's own prose, is one of the most devastating things in all of English-language fantasy literature. Not because of the light show, not because of the dramatic monologue, but because of the word she says after it is over, diminished. She says it about herself. She accepts it. She walks back into the garden and she is exactly what she was before Frodo offered her the ring, which is someone who has spent 35 centuries becoming someone worthy of refusing it. And she is still grieving. And she is still right. I want to ask you something, now that we have come all this way together. When you watch that scene in the film, or when you read it in the book, and Galadriel steps back, and the strange light goes out of her, and she is just a woman in a white dress, in a dark garden, do you feel relief? Or do you feel something else? Something closer to the feeling of watching someone who has carried a thing for a very long time finally set it down, not because they no longer want it, but because they understand what carrying it would cost the world. And they love the world more than they love themselves. Because that second feeling is what Tolkien spent his entire legendarium earning. That is the emotional destination he was walking toward, from the Ainulindal all the way to the Grey Havens. The feeling of something immeasurably precious, being freely given up, not in weakness, not in defeat, but in the fullness of understanding and the depth of love. If that hits you differently now than it did before you started watching this, then the lore did its work. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know, do you think Galadriel made the right call? Not in the abstract moral sense. Not just, obviously, yes, she was good and the ring was evil. I mean in the full weight of what we have built together here. The world she refused to make. The cost she paid. The children who would stand at windows in that world and not know what they were missing. Was it the right call? And if you are the kind of person who comes here to sit inside questions like that, who reads the Silmarillion for the same reason other people read philosophy, who thinks that Tolkien was doing something more than writing a fantasy story, this channel is the place for you. Subscribe. There is so much more to go into, and we are only just getting started.